internet, there's a group of people listening to this right now saying, oh, Andreessen's a shill, Rogan's shilling for Flock, this is what they're doing, they're trying to get the mass surveillance. This idea that it's easy to become a billionaire and that these billionaires somehow or another are the problem because they're not paying their fair share is so weird that's a narrative.
Joe Rogan exposed as Billionaire's puppet. Every few months, Joe Rogan reminds people why he became the biggest podcaster in the world. And then episodes like this happen.
Right. You could do that too. It's like this is one of the things that America is really good at. You really can just work 20 hours a day and achieve something spectacular. Yeah. This is a narrative that gets pushed along democratic socialists, that no one achieves substantial wealth without somehow or another victimizing other people.
Yeah. And then Jeff Bezos is the obvious counterexample, which is like every time you do the one click and the thing gets delivered to you 2 hours later at the cheapest possible price, saving you and your family a lot of time and money.
Like these Amazon warehouse guys are like fucking dying in the warehouse. Like,
are they?
Well, I mean, they talk about these work conditions that are sometimes deplorable, right? And then you have the people at the top with like hundreds of billions of dollars.
Spread it around.
A little bit, yeah.
Spread it around.
Seems like
probably better for everybody if you spread it around. Maybe.
Because what started as a conversation about crime, technology, and public safety quickly turned into something that made a lot of viewers deeply uncomfortable. A billionaire walked into one of the biggest podcasts on Earth and spent hours talking about why society needs more surveillance. And somehow, the conversation barely faced any resistance. For years, Joe Rogan built his reputation around skepticism. He questioned powerful institutions. He challenged politicians. He pushed back against mainstream narratives. Whether people agreed with him or not, viewers at least felt like he was willing to ask difficult questions. That's why this episode stood out so much, because instead of challenging power, many viewers felt like Joe was helping sell it. The controversy began almost immediately. Before the episode had even properly settled in, the conversation shifted toward a recent crime spree in Austin. Several teenagers had allegedly stolen vehicles, switched cars repeatedly, and carried out shootings across multiple locations. It was a serious story, but what happened next is what raised eyebrows. Rather than focusing on the crime itself, the discussion quickly became centered around a surveillance company called
Wild crime spree that happened this weekend in Austin. So it seems like it was it teenagers that were doing this?
Yeah.
Yeah? You're not on the microphone there, fella.
15 and 17 years
15 and 17 years old.
That's
and
terrible.
What was the purpose? Just going crazy?
I think so, yeah. They stole cars and stole guns and switched cars.
And they shot at like 10 different locations.
At least one person's in critical condition.
Yeah.
They shot multiple people. They had flock cameras in Austin, but then they shut those cameras off for political reasons.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
So please explain that.
Yeah. So these guys are driving around in cars, and they're switching cars, whatever. These guys running around. So there's a system called Flock, which is one of our companies, and what they do is kind of like in the movies. You take all the municipal cameras and traffic cameras and everything, and you feed them into an AI, and the AI is able to first find a license plate. And so this thing is deployed. It's sold to city governments. It's used all over the country. It solves crimes every day. We get reports on carjackings with kids in the back seat, and their lives get saved because they track them down. So a lot of towns and cities have this, and they love it. In cities like Austin, with the intense politics, they run into backlash on privacy and surveillance concerns. And so Austin had Flock and then turned it off. The late breaking news today is these guys drove into some adjacent town, up against Austin, and Flock was live in that town, and so Flock tagged them the minute they drove into that town, and then they caught the guys. Subsequent to that, the mayor, your mayor in Austin, your mayor and your chief of police gave a press conference and said, "We really need to rethink this because it's crazy."
And that wasn't just any random company. It was directly connected to Joe's guest. The argument sounded simple. A crime happened. The technology could have helped. Therefore, the technology should be expanded. At least that's how many viewers interpreted the conversation. The problem wasn't necessarily the technology itself. The problem was who was making the argument. Because the person explaining why these surveillance systems were necessary also happened to have financial interest connected to them. And that's where people started getting suspicious. For viewers unfamiliar with Marc Andreessen, he's not just another entrepreneur. He's one of the most influential figures in Silicon Valley. After helping create Netscape during the early internet boom, he went on to co-found Andreessen Horowitz, one of the largest venture capital firms in the world. His investments stretch across AI companies, crypto projects, social media platforms, and countless tech startups. In other words, when Mark Andreessen talks about technology, there is often a business incentive sitting somewhere in the background, which is exactly why viewers expected harder questions. Instead, many felt like they were watching a presentation, and things only became more controversial from there.
Their new mayor, and the big controversy there last week was their mayor did a video standing in front of somebody's home,
Yes.
calling him out by name.
Ken Griffin.
Ken Griffin.
Who's a very wealthy guy who brings a lot of jobs to New York City and was in the middle of a huge project. That's a $6 billion project. And now he's considering tanking it.
It's Ken, who I know. Ken is a major philanthropist. Ken has donated hundreds of millions of dollars, particularly to healthcare in New York City, on top of being a major taxpayer and source of tax revenue, on top of being a major employer. And so the new mayor has deliberately targeted him personally to try to force him out.
Why? Aren't they responsible for 50% of the tax base?
Yeah, on that order, yeah.
Something in the range
also
of
roughly
40
roughly
to
the case in California in the year 2000, 1,000 individuals were 50% of the tax revenue. It was the all-time peak, but I think it's roughly one.
What really caught people's attention wasn't just the surveillance discussion, it was the timing. Because only weeks earlier, Joe had been involved in conversations surrounding billionaire influence, powerful institutions, and whether wealthy people have too much control over society. Viewers had already watched multiple episodes where concerns about corporate power, AI, and political influence were debated. Then suddenly, one of the most powerful investors in the tech industry appears on the show, and the opening conversation revolves around why society might need more surveillance technology. For a lot of people watching, the optics weren't great, especially because the technology being discussed wasn't hypothetical. It already exists, it's already being deployed, and companies connected to Andreessen are already benefiting from it. The concern many viewers raised wasn't that crime prevention is bad. Most people want safer communities. Most people want criminals caught. The concern was what happens after these systems become normal, because history shows that technologies introduced for one purpose often end up being used for others later. That's where the conversation became much bigger than Flock itself. People weren't just talking about cameras, they were talking about data, and more importantly, who controls it. At one point, Joe briefly brought up concerns about abuse.
Is mass surveillance, right? And the concern is that someone's going to abuse this and use AI for nefarious purposes, right? Like what nefarious purposes would that be?
Yeah, so this is a system that could be used in bad ways. So if you had a corrupt, chief of police and, he had some personal entanglement thing and he wanted to track a, X whatever, or if you, the mayor, wanted to, do this to terrorize your political opponents or whatever.
Is there a blockchain for Flock so you could know who's doing what and how it's happening so someone couldn't abuse it? Is it possible to circumvent that?
Yeah, it could, but this is like the standard. Yes, and this, they log everything, and I'm sure there's records of everything. But look, it's like anything else. It's why cops have to get a warrant before they search somebody's house, right?
Right.
There's always the question of like, what is the legal authority and what are the safeguards?
These are the kinds of questions many viewers wanted explored further. Instead, critics felt the concerns were quickly brushed aside. The response largely centered around trust that procedures would be followed, trust that records would be kept, trust that safeguards would work. For some people, that wasn't particularly reassuring, because trust is exactly what many people feel has been broken by large institutions before, and that's why the conversation kept generating backlash online. Not because people suddenly support crime, not because they oppose technology, but because surveillance has always been one of those subjects where the stakes feel incredibly high. Once systems like these expand, rolling them back becomes much harder, and that's what made the discussion feel so important. The technology itself wasn't necessarily the entire issue. The issue was how little resistance it seemed to face during the conversation. Many viewers expected Joe Rogan to challenge the claims being made. Instead, they felt like he was helping reinforce them.
What's it called?
It's called ShotSpotter.
ShotSpotter?
ShotSpotter.
ShotSpotter. Oh, ShotSpotter. Like spot someone shooting.
Spot somebody shooting. So ShotSpotter is an older system that works very well. It's deployed in many cities. And what it is, totally different system. What it is they put these precision microphones on top of rooftops all over the city. And then when a gunshot goes off, they're able to instantly triangulate that a gunshot has gone off and specifically where the gunshot went off. Chicago got so wrapped up on these political issues that they also, not only do they not have Flock, they also turned off their ShotSpotter system voluntarily. And so people now get shot in Chicago and they bleed out on the street and nobody knows and nobody cares.
And what is the argument that they make?
that it is civil libertarian argument, which is all around surveillance and abuse and control and all these things. And like I say, I think that's a very legitimate argument. And then I would say there's like the woke argument, right, which is that the argument goes the American criminal justice system is clearly biased, that those will disproportionately affect disadvantaged people in society.
And that criticism only grew stronger as the episode continued, because eventually the discussion moved away from surveillance and straight into billionaires. That's where things really started getting messy. Up until this point, viewers were already debating the surveillance discussion. Then the conversation took another turn, because eventually the focus shifted away from technology and onto billionaires themselves. That's when a completely different criticism started emerging. At one point, Joe and Mark began discussing the idea that wealthy people are unfairly blamed for society's problems. The argument was familiar. Billionaires create companies. Companies create jobs. Therefore, attacks on billionaires are often driven by jealousy rather than legitimate concerns. For some viewers, that sounded reasonable. For others, it sounded completely detached from reality.
I'm not a businessman, although I kind of am.
You are.
I kind of am in some weird way. I've become a businessman.
Yeah.
But this idea that it's easy to become a billionaire and that these billionaires somehow or another are the problem because they're not paying their fair share is so weird that's a narrative that actually gets pushed through. Yeah, they make more money than everybody else. Right. You could do that too. It's like this is one of the things that America is really good at. Like this is a narrative that gets pushed along democratic socialists that no one achieves substantial wealth without somehow or another victimizing other people.
Yeah. And then Jeff Bezos is the obvious counterexample, which is like every time you do the one click and the thing gets delivered to you 2 hours later at the cheapest possible price, saving you and your family a lot of time and money.
But at the expense of small mom and pop stores, allegedly.
Although a lot of them sell on Amazon, a lot of small businesses sell on Amazon. Many European countries have a much more draconian, are much even more hostile to business, and the result is they're much poorer. They're slower growth.
And this is where the backlash really started growing. Because critics weren't arguing that successful people shouldn't be wealthy. Most people understand that innovation, entrepreneurship, and risk-taking can create enormous value. The issue was how simplified the conversation felt. Complex discussions about wealth inequality, lobbying, political influence, corporate power, and worker conditions were being reduced to one basic idea. If billionaires exist, they probably earned it. That framing frustrated a lot of people, especially when examples like Jeff Bezos started being brought into the discussion. The conversation focused heavily on the convenience Amazon provides: fast shipping, low prices, easy access to products, all real benefits. But viewers immediately pointed out something important. That's not actually the criticism people make. The criticism isn't that Amazon provides no value. The criticism is whether the benefits created by these companies are distributed fairly. And that's a much more complicated discussion, one that many people felt never really happened during the episode. Instead, critics felt like every concern was being treated as either misinformation or resentment, and that perception kept getting stronger. By this point, the surveillance debate had already divided the audience. Then the fact-checking started, and that's where many viewers felt the conversation began falling apart. At one stage, statistics were pulled up regarding gunshot detection technology and how often certain alerts actually led to confirmed incidents. The numbers weren't exactly flattering. According to the data being discussed, a large percentage of alerts resulted in officers arriving without finding evidence of a gun-related crime.
Surveillance tech is often inaccurate, according to research that allowed activists to launch a fact-based campaign and a political model for organizers in other cities. Aha! So they're saying it's inaccurate. 88.72% of incidents flagged by ShotSpotter ended with police finding no incidents of gun crime. Okay.
But
right.
But that doesn't mean the gunshots didn't go off.
Exactly. That doesn't mean anything. Rarely produce evidence of a gun-related crime. That also doesn't mean anything, because it just shows.
For many viewers, that seemed like a pretty important detail, because the entire selling point of these systems is accuracy. If the technology is constantly generating questionable alerts, then naturally people are going to ask whether expanding it everywhere is actually a good idea. But instead of focusing on that concern, critics felt the conversation immediately shifted toward defending the technology. If the surveillance surveillance discussion made viewers uncomfortable, this next part made them furious, because eventually the conversation shifted toward a familiar topic: hard work. More specifically, the idea that becoming a billionaire is largely the result of working harder than everyone else. At first, it sounded like a standard motivational talking point: work harder, take risks, build something valuable, achieve success. Nothing particularly controversial there. But then the conversation kept going. At one point, Joe suggested that people can achieve extraordinary success if they're willing to put in extraordinary effort.
Level.
Mm-hmm.
That there's these corporations that make like hundreds of billions of dollars, and they're like, yeah, they didn't pay tax on this because they're this corporation, and then not pay tax on it. And you're like,
Well, supposedly that's what Jeffrey Epstein did for people. He
Found
helped-
those tax
he helped
loopholes?
people with tax loopholes and
it exists for a reason, right?
well, scumbags.
yeah.
They've all put it in place. And then there's that thing where like no one should be a billionaire. Well, okay, hang on. Do you like having a fucking iPhone?
Yeah.
Somebody had to make that. They're working 16 hours a day. They like you don't want to be Tim Cook. You don't want to be Steve Jobs. Guy
Yeah.
died young because of it.
But I guess the argument that some people make against that is not that that guy shouldn't be wealthy. It's that when they have this overabundance of wealth, and that the people that also work there, like these Amazon
Right.
warehouse guys, are like fucking dying in the warehouse. And like, you're
Are
like,
they?
Well, I mean, they talk about these work conditions that are sometimes deplorable, right? And then you have the people at the top with like hundreds.
Again, on the surface, that sounds reasonable. Most successful people do work incredibly hard. The problem was what many viewers felt was being left out of the conversation, because hard work alone doesn't explain billionaire-level wealth, and that's where the backlash exploded. People immediately pointed out something obvious. Millions of people already work exhausting hours. Construction workers, nurses, truck drivers, factory workers, warehouse employees, restaurant staff, delivery drivers. Some of these people work double shifts for years. Many barely manage to stay ahead of their bills, yet none of them are becoming billionaires. That's why critics felt the discussion was oversimplifying something far more complicated. The reality is that wealth on that scale usually involves much more than effort alone, and once someone accumulates significant wealth, that wealth often continues growing on its own. That's one of the biggest reasons the conversation frustrated so many people. Because critics weren't saying successful people don't deserve success. They were saying the system is more complicated than simply work harder, and many felt the episode wasn't acknowledging that complexity at all. Instead, the discussion kept drifting toward the idea that criticism of billionaires mostly comes from people who don't understand how wealth is created. For viewers already concerned about wealth inequality, that came across as incredibly dismissive, and the criticism only intensified when certain billionaire examples started being treated almost like public heroes. Again, this wasn't necessarily about one specific billionaire. It was about the broader pattern people felt they were watching. Every concern about wealth concentration seemed to get minimized. Every criticism felt brushed aside. Every powerful figure received the benefit of the doubt. Eventually, viewers started asking themselves a simple question: when was the last time Joe Rogan seriously challenged a billionaire on these topics? Not agreed with them, not sympathized with them, actually challenged them. Surprisingly, a lot of people struggled to come up with an answer. That's why the reaction to this episode became so much bigger than surveillance cameras or AI technology. For many viewers, those were just symptoms. The real issue was something else entirely. They felt like Joe Rogan had changed, and that's where the conversation became much more personal. That's what made this episode different from a normal controversy. But what do you think? Has Joe Rogan become too comfortable around powerful people, or is the backlash completely overblown? Drop your honest opinion in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, because we're covering the biggest creator and internet controversies every day. Thanks for watching.